There's a problem with the room start event. It's a problem you might have in your game and might not even know. And the worst part is, this problem can suddenly appear after a seemingly unrelated change. Let's talk about it. Before we get into the problem itself, what is the room start event? When does it happen? Why should you use it? If you did the homework I suggested in my GM Anatomy video on code execution order, you might already know the answer, but let's look at it. In this test project, I have several objects I've dropped in the room. They all have a create event, some instance creation code, and a room start event. The room itself also has room creation code, and I've shuffled the instance creation order a bit to see if that will affect anything. When we run the game, we can look at the output log to see the event execution order. So for each instance, the create event and room instance creation code all runs. Then after all the instances are done with that, the room creation code happens. And then the room start event for each instance happens in what appears to be creation order. So the room start event is one of the last events to run before your game really gets going again after changing rooms. If you are in the room start event, you can be sure that all the other instances have ran their create events and instance creation code by the time you get there. I've seen some users put code in one instance's create event that looks for a variable set in another instance's create event. And if that creation order isn't carefully curated, the other instance will exist, but it may not have actually ran its create event yet and set that variable. So trying to access it will crash. This sort of logic should be done in the room start event. But hold on. Let's look at this list again. What is this? What is instance 100,000? Its create event wasn't ran up above, so where did it come from? Well, we are actually in the second room of this example project. The first room has a persistent object that I created, and we can see its create and room start events if we scroll up a bit right under the about to start room line. When I press space in the step event, we changed the room with all the other instances we've already looked at. So persistent objects also execute their room start event at the start of a new room, and likely before the room start event of any instances that were dropped in the room. But again, this order is not guaranteed. It's undocumented behavior. And even if it is reliable and can be controlled by manipulating the instance creation order, what about persistent objects that are dynamically created using instance create depth or layer? Do those just always run their room start event last? Is there really no way to control that? No, I don't think there is. I'm honestly not sure. But when it comes right down to it, control of the order the room start event happens for a collection of instances is always going to be a bit nebulous. But is this really a problem? If you've watched my doors and room transitions tutorial, you've already heard me talk about this, but let's recap for everyone else. I have two persistent controller objects. In each, I have a room start event. In the camera manager, I snap the view to the player's position, and in the transition manager, I update the player's position. So the two events have a shared target, the player, and specifically, the player's position is very important in both. When I get to a new room, which of these two events happened first? Any ideas? Does it help to know that the transition manager is dynamically created as needed, whereas the camera is created in the first room of my game? No, not really. We have no way to reliably control the order these two room start events execute. So if the transition manager goes before the camera object, no problem. Everything will work seamlessly. But if the camera happens first, it will snap to the position of my player instance, assuming the player instance even exists at this point, and then the transition manager will come along and reposition the player to where they should be based on the door they just went through. The result is that when the game actually starts running, the camera object will be like, whoa, I'm not looking at the player, and will slide across the room to get into position as the room starts. It won't look good, and it'll be very distracting. And the really frustrating thing about this problem is that what can change this order under the hood will seem pretty random. Adding or removing instances in your rooms, building your game for a different target platform, or even just upgrading your project to a more recent version of GameMaker. Even though it seems to work consistently for you right now, this is undocumented behavior you are relying on, and GameMaker will not apologize for breaking this in an update if you are relying on it. Additionally, while I don't use it very often myself, the room end event has a similar issue. Really, any non-draw event that can happen on multiple instances during the same step that doesn't also have a begin and end variant can have this issue. So how do we solve this? Well, I bet you can think of a few ways. Really, the big issue here is just being aware that this is a problem. Once you know it can happen, there are a million different ways to solve this issue, especially if you just want to solve it on a case-by-case basis. Let's take my exact situation. The problem is that my camera may not snap to my player after I've positioned them in the room start event of my transition manager. So just snap the camera again. It's not really going to hurt anything. So we just call the snap function after we position the player, and we're done. With this solution, you need to be very cognizant of when this issue can happen for any combination of room start events in your project and handle them individually. And I'm not a fan of this. It tightly couples my transition manager and my camera together. I don't want my transition manager controlling my camera. That's not its job. And as my game gets bigger and there are more manager objects with more room start events, I don't want this web of possible dependencies spread out in all of that code. It seems like a mess and just future bugs waiting to happen. So from talking to other developers on the GM Discord server, the most common solution is similar to the one I suggested in my transition tutorial. You pick one object or create a new persistent manager object, and it's the only object that gets to have a room start event. If we can't control the order they happen in, then just have one of them. For any object, if you want to have a room start event, you instead wrap that code in a method, and then call that method in this one room start event in the order you want them to execute. I always want my transition object to happen first, and then my camera. So I just type the code in that order in this one room start event. We use with to handle multiple instances and instances not existing for whatever reason. This is fine. Like I said, many developers handle it this way and it'll work. But again, I'm not a big fan. Now, every time I need a new room start event, I have to write the code in that object's create event, which I don't take issue with. But then I have to go add code to this other object to make sure the event actually runs. And if I'm being honest, this isn't that big of an issue. I mean, how many room start events do I really need in my project? It can't be that many that this is going to add hours to my development, right? So this is probably the best solution. But it's not the coolest. Okay, so what are the primary goals here? First, obviously, have more control over the order that room start events execute in. Second, support for any event. Room end, global mouse left pressed, async events, doesn't matter. Third, keep all code related to an object in that object. I don't want to have to go edit another object just because this object needs custom event handling. And finally, just to do some cool stuff, I'm going to be using a bunch of intermediate to advanced features of GML as we build this system. And I've made some design decisions that are worth discussing. So if nothing else, hopefully watching me solve this very specific problem will inspire you to solve other problems using some of these ideas. So again, this solution is probably overcomplicating it and not worth the effort. I'm admitting that. So I don't need you down in the comments saying, actually this is totally unnecessary and overly complicated. Yes, I know. But it's cool and it was fun to build. So let's build it. If you've watched my doors and transition tutorial, which you should, it's a cool tutorial, this project is currently in the same state as the end of part 2. So if we open up my transition manager, there's a room start event. And if I open my camera, it also has a room start event. I want to make sure that the camera's room start always happens after the transition manager's room start. So as usual, I'm going to pretend that the system I want to use already exists. How would I want this to work? Let's start with the camera. I'm going to cut the code out of the current room start and open up the create event. I want to tell this new system that I want this code to be ran on room start after other events. So I'm going to call the function register custom event because I want to eventually support more than just room start. So I need to tell it which event I want it to be. In this case, room start. For now, I'll just pass a string. I also need to tell the system which order I want this code to execute relative to other code registered by this same system. So we have a decision to make. We could use a priority system, basically a number that tells the system how important it is. But I don't think it's a good fit for this. For starters, priority is always a bit ambiguous. If something is your first priority, it's also your highest priority. It's a bit confusing. So should a priority of 1 happen before a priority of 5? Or should 5 happen before 1 because 5 is the higher number? Ultimately, I don't even want to deal with that possible confusion. And I don't think I need that much granularity. And we already have a pattern for this situation in GameMaker. We have begin step, step, end step. We have draw begin, draw end. I like this bucket approach. It's very clear which is first, second, and third, and you don't get overwhelmed by all the possible priority values. We can always add more levels of granularity if we really need them, but starting with 3 should be fine. So again, I'll just use a string for this. I want this to be after my transition manager's room start, so I'll just pass end. And finally, I need to pass the code I want to actually run on room start. I'll wrap it in a function and pass it as the last argument for this function that doesn't exist. So maybe it's time to make it exist. I'm going to create a new script called register custom event. We know we need 3 arguments: the event string, the bucket string, and the function. And right off the bat, we've already ran into our first problem. What are we doing with these arguments? We obviously have to store the function somewhere so we can call it later, but where? We could have a manager object or a global variable that stores it all in some sort of library or table, but then we'll need to manage that data. As instances get created or destroyed, we'll have to add to and remove from that table, which is not something I want to deal with. So let's just shove it into the instance who called this function. But what is it we're shoving in here? What's the goal? We know we need to store the function that's being passed in, but we want to store it in such a way that we can find the correct function for the correct event and for the correct bucket of that custom event. That's a pretty complicated structure, so we should probably use a struct. I'm going to do something kind of cool here. I want to add a variable to this instance to hold this struct, but I only want to set that variable once. That way, if you call this function multiple times to have both a room start begin and a room start end, they won't stomp over each other. I could use variable instance exists to check if it exists, and if it doesn't, initialize it, but that's not cool. Let's do something cool. Check this out. Okay, what is this? We are doing a few things here. First, we are using the self struct to access a variable called custom events, with 2 underscores to help prevent possible collisions with existing instance variables. If that variable doesn't exist on the current instance, the null coalescence operator, the double question mark thing followed by an equal sign, will set that variable to an empty struct. If it does exist, it won't do anything. It's basically the same thing as this code, but all in one line. So this struct is going to have another struct for the event we want to support, and that struct will hold the function for each timing bucket. So we actually need to do that same thing again. Look at the custom event variable to see if this event exists, and if it doesn't exist, initialize it to an empty struct. Then we can just shove the function into the custom event using a chained accessor with 2 string arguments we passed in. I realize this can be a bit confusing, so let's set a breakpoint on the first line of this function and use the debugger to watch this work. Down in the Variables Locals tab, we can see the self section. Let's expand that out and we can see all the custom functions I've defined for my camera. There is no custom event variable. So let's step, and there it is. If we expand it, it's empty. So let's step again. And now we have a room start section in here. It's also empty. So step one more time, and we are back in the camera's create event. But we can see we now have a function stored in our end bucket of our room start property. So this is all working great. The camera now has a registered custom room start end event. But it doesn't do anything. That function is never called and is entirely useless at this point. Probably time to solve that. Let's create a new object and call it Object Custom Event Manager. This dude is going to be responsible for handling any and all custom events we want to support, so he probably should be persistent. Right now we only need to support the room start event, so let's add it. This will be the only object in my entire project that has this event. Now we have an interesting problem. We want this object to go through every object that has a custom event and execute those functions. But how is it going to find these objects? Tags. Once again, tags are awesome and I use them for so many things. But unlike what I've done in my previous videos, we are not going to assign tags manually. We are going to assign them through code. Let's go back to our register function. At the very bottom, let's use asset add tags to give the calling object a tag for the event being registered. We've passed that event as a string already, so we can just use it. And now, anytime we register a custom event, the object that registered that event can now be found by that tag. Super handy. Back in the room start event of our manager, let's grab all objects that have a room start tag. We can loop through that array of object indexes, use a with statement to loop through all active instances of each of those, and execute their custom events.roomstart.end function. We don't even need to check to make sure that variable exists. We know if they have the tag, they got that custom events variable at the same time. Well, mostly. We are making a bit of an assumption that we set up the end room start function and not any other possible event bucket. Maybe we should make that a little more clear. Up at the top, let's define some macros for the different buckets that we want to support. Following the same pattern that other built-in events have, let's support begin, normal, and end. I'm going to prefix these macros with CE for custom event and use all caps snake case because that's the naming convention I always use for macros. Real quick, let's go use that macro when we register our custom event in the camera's create event. Great, back to the room start event. So we have these macros for each bucket that we want to support. If we had them in an array in the order we want to execute them, we could just loop over them. But we need the loop we already have to be inside this loop, since we want all the begin functions to happen before any of the normal functions and then all of the normal before any of the end. So we loop through all the buckets, grab the current one, then loop through all of the tagged objects, and for each one, use with to loop through every active instance of that object and execute the current event bucket for that instance. However, if that specific bucket hasn't been registered for this instance, that's going to crash. So we should probably pull that out into a var real quick, make sure it isn't undefined, and if it isn't, then we can execute it. The core functionality is all working, but we only support room start right now, and the goal was to support any event we'd want to do this in, right? So let's make this code more reusable. Let's cut all of this out of room start event, including our macros, and paste them in the create event. I'll wrap the logic in a method called execute event, and it's going to take an event name as an argument. Then, everywhere we say room start, we just replace with our event argument. Back in the room start event, we can call this method and pass in room start, and this might be a good time to turn the event label itself into a macro. I don't like trying to remember if I used underscores in my event names or if I capitalized them or whatever. So let's define a CE room start macro and then go use that when we register the event real fast. Now, if we wanted to add support for the room end event, we would just add the event to this manager, create the macro, and call execute event. Done. We can even expand our timing buckets if we want more granular control. I could add another bucket called first and one called last. Then just add those two to the start and end of my array down in execute event, and now we have 5 possible buckets to choose from. Actually, while we're here, let's change one other thing. Technically, every time we call execute event, we create a brand new array for the timing bucket order. But once we've compiled our game, that array should never change. Since we are in a method now, we can actually use the static keyword instead of var to make sure this line of code is only ever ran the first time this function is called. It's a micro optimization for sure, but we are here to do cool stuff, and I think that's cool. So there it is. The last thing to do is to go through the project and convert any remaining room start events to use this new custom event system. That should just be my transition manager. I want my transition manager to happen before my camera manager. The camera manager is using the end bucket, so the transition manager will just use the normal bucket. And there you go. You now have a robust, extensible custom event system thing. Now some of you might be thinking, hey, can I use this to replace the step event of all of my objects so I can fully control the order every single instance executes their step event in? No, don't do that, please. The overhead of this sort of system with our essentially 3D for loop is not insignificant. This will work fine for one-off events like room start and room end, but trying to plug a large number of instances into this system with an event that runs every frame is going to cause some serious performance issues at scale. This really should be used sparingly. But regardless, it's a functioning, extendable system that accomplishes all of my goals. If you followed along and found an interesting way to use this system in your project, tell me about it in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you get notified when I post a new one. You can support me on Patreon if you want, and if you want to ask questions or hang out with other GameMaker developers, I recommend joining the GM Discord server. There's a link in the description below. Thanks for watching. Now go make something awesome. Special thanks to my Cash Cardinals, DJ Gibbles, Fixing the Stupid, and Peter Jorgensen.